Hi, I'm Scott. I'm with the Authors at Google New York program. I'm really excited about today's speaker. I'm a longtime activist, and I've learned that when you want to go out and try and change the world, the best way to do it is one person at a time. And I think that's what today's author did in her first-time book, My Guantánamo Diary, and she'll tell you the rest. The first line of the book is kind of apropos. It was, "Google got me to Gitmo." And so now I think it's appropriate that Gitmo got Mahvish Khan? Mahvish Khan, I'm sorry. Mahvish Khan to Google. So please welcome our speaker today.
Hi there. I do feel really indebted to Google because it was because of Google that I got to Gitmo. And what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about my book and how I got involved, and then turn it back over to you guys because I'm sure you have questions. But basically, I got involved at Guantanamo while I was still a law student, and I was in an international law class studying the federal torture statutes and the cases at Guantanamo, and just remember feeling outraged that, we were imprisoning men without giving them a charge or hiding them from the world, and essentially denying them the same rights that any alleged rapist or murderer has in America. And I was also baffled that Washington policymakers were debating the legality of these medieval torture techniques, because once upon a time it was called Chinese water torture, and today in America it's waterboarding. But while I was a law student studying these cases, I Googled the cases that I was studying because I wanted to get involved and find out who the attorneys were on the cases, and found out who they were, got in touch with them, and got my foot in the door as an interpreter because I speak Pashto. I grew up in an Afghan American household, and we spoke Pashto at home. And I quickly found out that there were no Pashto interpreters who had security clearance. So the attorneys representing Guantanamo Bay detainees, the Afghans anyway, were not able to meet their clients because there was nobody who spoke the language. And so that's how I initially got involved. And eventually the role developed and I began representing a detainee of my own. But for the most part, my work was as an interpreter at Gitmo. And I went through a series of background checks with the FBI going back 10 years. They pulled all of my transcripts, met my teachers, landlords, friends, going back, to every city that I'd lived in, and I'd moved around a lot. So once I got the clearance, I went to the base in January of 2006, and I remember on my first trip to the base being nervous and scared because everything that I had heard in the media about the worst of the worst had settled in, and I anticipated meeting somebody who was Taliban or a member of Al-Qaeda, and I, wondered whether they'd want to sit down with me because I was a woman and traveling with these male attorneys, and so I was definitely nervous. And I remember going into that first meeting room, and I'd covered my hair because I didn't know how conservative the prisoner would be coming from Afghanistan. And when I walked in, there was this guy across the room, and he was shackled to the floor. And he looked just as nervous as I did, perhaps because he anticipated meeting an interrogator or somebody from the military. And he smiled at me because I was wearing this shawl, and I smiled back and gave him the universal Islamic greeting, which is "May peace be upon you," and went over and shook hands with my first terrorist. And the guards knew him as prisoner 1154. And I found through that meeting and getting to know him through his files, through his military transcripts, and through his family, and gathering evidence from Afghanistan, that it made no sense why this guy was at Guantanamo. His real name was Dr. Ali Shah Musavi. He was a pediatrician, and he worked for the United Nations. He was a Shiite Muslim, and Shiites are a persecuted minority in Afghanistan and by the Taliban. And so his wife was an economist, and he had 3 young kids, and he fled to neighboring Iran so that he could escape the oppressive regime of the Taliban. And yet he only returned to Afghanistan once the Taliban were toppled, and yet he was there being accused of working with the Taliban. And even the presiding officer in his military tribunal, in his combatant status review tribunal, stated that he found it, baffling that this guy, or unimaginable that whatever the allegations that were made against him, that he was actually arrested and brought all the way to Guantanamo. And so that was my first experience with a Guantanamo Bay detainee. And then the second day on that same base trip, I met prisoner number 1009. And, I went through the same feelings of fear, thinking, well, that was a pediatrician, but surely I'm going to meet somebody who's more hardcore today. And I walk in, and there's this 80-year-old paraplegic, and he can't walk because he suffered from 2 strokes 15 years before. And he was bedridden, brought to Guantanamo on a stretcher. And he had cataracts. He couldn't see or hear very well. And his name was Haji Nusrat. And the military made absolutely no concessions for his old age or his situation, because his immobile legs were shackled to the floor. And I just remember Haji Nusrat asking why he was being hidden from the world, because his belief was, if I've done something wrong, charge me and put me on a public trial before the world. And he also wanted to know why journalists couldn't visit him at Guantanamo and tell his story. Because while the military purports to allow journalists at Guantanamo Bay, in fact, they're given this, very sanitary Mickey Mouse sort of tour of the base and shown a model cell, and they're never allowed to meet the prisoners, which are the most central part of the story. And it was after these meetings that I realized that at the center of this big Guantanamo debate lies something much more fundamental than habeas corpus and due process, which I'm sure all of you have heard so much about in the news. And it's not about these abstract court cases and legal principles, which is why I initially got involved, but it is about human beings. And I understood during that first meeting why they are hidden in Guantanamo, outside of U.S. court jurisdiction and outside of the reaches of the courts and the law and the press, because to all of us in the media and to the world in general, they're known collectively as Guantanamo detainees. We don't know them as individuals. They are one mass group of nameless, faceless foreigners. And not knowing who they are as individuals makes their indefinite detention and abuse definitely more palatable. And it was also on that first trip that I understood why they were serial numbered. The Guantanamo detainees are stripped of their names, their individualities, and when you give something a name, whether it's an animal or a person, it makes it individual and unique and gives it unique characteristics. That's what a name does. And when you serialize something, serial numbers are for things that are animate, that are made in a series, that are all alike. And that's what happened to the Guantanamo detainees, because in Bagram Air Base, which is north of Afghanistan, before they're brought to Guantanamo, they had their facial hair shaved, their eyebrows, their beards, their hair, and they were all dressed alike in the same, prison uniforms, and they they were all numbered. And it's easier to abuse something called 1009 or 1154 when you don't know his name, when you don't know who he is, that he is in fact, a pediatrician or somebody's grandfather. And it's easier to dole out that abuse when he is just a serial number. But this book is also, it's not just about old men and pediatricians and poor guys who have been tortured. And it's a diary. And over my experience there, over a 2-year period, and it will give you a behind-the-scenes look at who's at Guantanamo, who the guards are, who the attorneys were, our relationships that formed with the lawyers. It talks about friendships that were formed, interfaith dialogue between attorneys and the detainees, and it takes you to a place and lets you meet individuals and really get to know their personalities. And through these meetings at Guantanamo with the men that I met, I also got a better sense of my own heritage, because growing up in America with Pashtun parents, there was often this balancing act of East and West, and I often, traded those ideas with the prisoners, because a lot of times they wanted to connect with me. I think they often saw me as a sister or a daughter, and they called me as such. Like, they would reference me as, sister. And we formed these familial sorts of relationships over the course of 2 years. And I visited many of them after they've been released. And in return, I also tried to bring them a semblance of their culture, because they'd been stripped of everything. And it was often small things like finding out what their favorite foods were, cooking them rice and lamb, or bringing them, Starbucks chai, because it was the closest thing to the type of tea they would drink back home. And they, all of them without fail would quiz me about school and how my exams were going, whether I was married yet or not. And it went on like that. And the book is about those friendships that also developed. And many Americans, like myself, I initially assumed that everybody at Guantanamo must have done something to have been there. And when I learned about the bounties, that's when I became convinced of how the mistakes had been committed. And what happened was the U.S. military airdropped thousands of bounty leaflets all across Afghanistan, offering up to $25,000 per Taliban or Al-Qaeda. And when you offer $25,000 to Afghans, it's like winning the Super Lotto jackpot, because the average Afghan makes about 80 cents a day, which is about $300 a year. And it's a completely lawless country where ethnic and tribal, political, geographic feuds go back for generations. And adding this huge financial incentive into the mix was, it created this momentum and black market for individuals to turn one another in that they had issues with. So, it's speculated that Dr. Ali Shah, he came from this prominent family and he wanted to run for parliament. He was working with the UN, involved in politics, and it's possible that a political opponent turned him in. 86% of the detainees at Guantanamo Bay, according to unclassified Department of Defense documents, are there not because of U.S. intelligence, but because of locals turning one another in at a time when they were benefiting hugely financially. And the problem with all of this is, because there's nothing wrong with offering, bounty money for terror suspects, but when there is not an investigation done following, it just created this rampant system of mistakes. And the mistakes were individuals' lives that have been affected. And I would like to read for you a passage from my book about Haji Nusrat, the 80-year-old, when we left him at our first meeting. As the meeting ended, it was obvious that the old man was in pain. His legs hurt, and he tried to stand and stretch them. He pushed hard against the tabletop with his palms, trying to lift his weight. I leapt to his side and helped him stand. He gripped the edge of the table for balance and exhaled deeply. A few moments later, I helped him sit back down. As we started collecting our things to go, I turned to Nusrat, who was watching us gather up the pizza boxes and pistachio shells and unfinished baklava. The military didn't allow any food to be left with the detainee, so we had to take any leftovers with us. Bache, my child, tell your mother and your father that an old man with a white beard sends his salams, he said. I responded with the customary reply, Wa alaikum assalam, and may peace also be upon you. I adjusted my shawl one last time and glanced at him. He was quiet for a moment, then he opened his heavy arms to me, and I embraced him. He pushed my head into his white prison uniform, and for several moments prayed for me as Peter watched. Insha'Allah, God willing, you will find a home that makes you happy. Insha'Allah, you will be a mother one day. Insha'Allah, you will have a family that will always protect you. I'm gonna let you guys finish the prayer. But the reason why that resonated so much with me is because here was this guy who had nothing. He, didn't have his freedom. He didn't have his health. He was kept in a cage that I'm sure none of us would keep our pets in. And yet he found it within him to pray for me. And I thought it spoke volumes of his goodness of spirit. But that said, the prisoners at Guantanamo vary so much. Like any two individuals in this room, their personalities were so different. And it was like, and I think that was another, flawed assumption I made going in, that I assumed that they would all be the same. They're all Middle Eastern men, and even though I come from that background, it's all you hear, the Guantanamo detainees, and you don't take their personalities into account. And the second passage that I'd like to read for you will explain just how different the two personalities are. And pardon me if this offends any of you, like some of the language. I know it's not good to play favorites, but I couldn't help it. Of all the detainees we worked with, I most look forward to meetings with Taj Muhammad. Taj, number 902, was a 27-year-old goat herd from Kunar, Afghanistan, who formed crushes on his female interrogators and had taught himself perfect English in his 4 years at Guantanamo. It's not that I liked Taj better than the other detainees. They're all different, but he was easy to talk to, and he made me laugh. I felt sorry for Haji Nusrat, who was old and sick, and for Ali Shah Musawi because he was so polite. But Taj was my age and loaded with personality. Unlike the others, he rarely came across as vulnerable. He was highly opinionated and very sarcastic. Even his misogyny was somehow comical. I'm sure he would have gotten on my nerves if I'd spent more time listening to his sarcastic wisecracks, but in our limited contact, he was pure entertainment. In our meeting with Paul Rashkin of the Miami Federal Defenders, Taj's attention was always drawn to written English. He would sound out the lettering on coffee cups and napkins, and when legal papers were put on the table, he would immediately start reading under his breath. He asked us repeatedly to bring him a Pashto English dictionary so he could improve his English. Over several months, he had compiled and memorized a list of almost 1,000 English words. But during a routine search, the guards had found and confiscated his neatly written glossary. When Paul told him it was unlikely that he'd be given permission to bring him a book, Taj looked unhappy. "If you can't bring me a book, how do you plan on getting me out of here?" he said. "Even the interrogators give us magazines." I asked what kind of magazines. "Playboy," he said. I'd heard the same from guards at the Clipper Club, who said that lots of detainees made associations between American women based on what they saw in the softcore men's magazine Maxim. Sometimes the guards seemed to help that along. At the beginning of my second meeting with Taj, he pulled out a small piece of creased white paper and handed it to me. "I told the guards that the girl who speaks Pashto is coming, and I asked them to make a list of words so you could translate them for me," he said. My jaw dropped as I scanned the list. "What does it say?" Taj asked. "Tell me." The first word on the list was bestiality. The second was pedophile. The third was intercourse. And the fourth was horny. I think those soldiers have played a little trick on you and me, I smiled. Tell me, he persisted, what did they write? I don't know how to say these words in Pashto, I responded. I learned Pashto from my parents. Taj's eyes widened. Okay, just tell me one of the words, he insisted. I don't know them, I said. Then tell me what it means. I scanned the words again. Bestiality means showing mina, affection or love to one of those goats you tend, I said, smiling, but it's not a good sort of mina. Taj let out a laugh. He got the picture. He grabbed a pen from the table and scribbled something in Pashto next to bestiality. That's when I realized that he had probably known the nature of his vocabulary lessons all along. So the point of those two passages is to show you how different the experiences were at Guantanamo, and it went on like that. I profiled 10 prisoners, and you really get a sense of who they are, and you'll feel like you got to know them too. And in between their stories is a journey of going to Guantanamo, going to Afghanistan. Meeting the prisoners at Guantanamo definitely strengthened my desire to go to Afghanistan, and I went there on behalf of some of the prisoners to help collect exonerating evidence and affidavits for them, because they aren't allowed those basic rights that U.S. criminal defendants have. And the book talks about my experiences at Guantanamo in Afghanistan as an Afghan American going there for the first time, and it's definitely, again, a balancing of East and West, and how I got to know the locals. And I found Afghanistan to be a beautiful country that is perpetually devastated by tragedy, and the Afghans are these charming, hospitable people, and yet whether it was the women with their oppression or the conflicts, or the men being rounded up and taken to Bagram or Afghanistan, it was definitely an eye-opening experience. And as well as my own dynamic meeting released prisoners, because Dr. Ali Shah was released, and I was really excited that he was in Afghanistan at the same time that I was, because he still had some family in Iran. And so I went out to see him, and he'd never been charged and released after 3.5 years. And I remember, seeing him for the first time, and it was just this incredible release, because I saw him free and with his family and safe for the first time. And I wanted to give him this big bear hug, but Afghan culture throws up so many barriers between men and women. And, we were in public, so I had to settle for a handshake. And it was definitely a little disappointing, but the Afghans are also so poetic. And he kept telling me how happy he was to see me, and went on like that for a while. And I met his family and his mother. And when I finally left that night, they had a wedding to go to, and they asked me to stay for the wedding, and I couldn't stay because he lived in the South, and it was kind of dangerous to travel at night, and I wanted to get back to Kabul. And he said, a wedding is a happy occasion, and you coming here today has brought us the happiness of 2 weddings. So that definitely made up for the hug that I didn't get. But I'm going to read you one last passage. And this was of a prisoner who attempted suicide multiple times. And it's definitely more grim than Taj's chapter, but he wanted his story told and his letters to be shared with the world. So on one of the occasions that he tried to attempt suicide, his attorney walked in on him, and he, prior to the suicide attempt, he handed his lawyer a letter and asked for a bathroom break. So the attorney called the guards, and the guards took the prisoner to the bathroom. and they lock him in the cage, and he goes to the bathroom there. And so the lawyer's sitting around waiting outside, and it's taking a while. And this guy has a history of trying to kill himself, so he got worried and walks over to the cell and opens the door. There's like a meeting room and a cage, and the prisoner's in the cage. So he opens the meeting room, and he sees this enormous pool of blood growing. And before he had a chance to call out his name, he just sees this blood and yanks the door open, runs in, and he sees his client, who he'd gotten to know over several years now, hanging in the cage cell. He'd made a noose and hung himself and slashed his arm. And so he was unconscious, and his tongue kind of lulled from his mouth. And the lawyer tried to get into the cage, and he's shaking at the door, and it's locked. And he's screaming his name, and he screams for the guards. And the prisoner's unconscious, and they tell the lawyer to leave. And fortunately, he didn't die, and they did resuscitate him. But when his attorney went back to his offices in New York and eventually got the letter translated, this is what it was. In fact, I don't know how to begin or where to begin. I feel very sorry for forcing you to see a human being who suffered too much dying before your eyes. There was no alternative to make our voice heard by the world from the depths of the detention centers. I hope you will always remember that you met and sat with a human being called Juma, who suffered too much and was abused in his belief, his self, in his dignity, and also in his humanity. He was imprisoned, tortured, and deprived of his homeland, his family, and his young daughter. Remember that there are hundreds of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. They are in the same situation of suffering and misfortune. They were captured, tortured, and detained with no offense or reason. Their lives might end like mine. When you remember me in my last gasps of life before dying, while my soul is leaving my body to rise to its creator, remember that the world let us down and let our case down. Remember that our governments let us down. Remember the unreasonable delay of the courts in looking into our case to side with the victims of injustice. If there were judges who had been fair, I wouldn't have been wrapped in death shrouds now. And my family, my father, my mother, my brothers, sisters, and my little girl would not have to lose me. But what else can I do? Take some of my blood, take pieces of my death shrouds, take some of my remains, take pictures of my dead body when I am placed in my grave, send it to the world, to the judges, to the people with live conscience, to the people with principles and values. At this moment, I see death looming in front of me while I write this letter. Death has a bad odor that cannot be smelled except by those who are going through its agony. Farewell. I thank you for everything you have done for me. But I have a final request. Show the world the letters I gave you and let the world read them. Let the world know the agonies of the detainees in Cuba. Prisoner of deprivation, Juma Abdul-Latif al-Dosri. I'd like to end by offering that I don't believe that the U.S. military did all of this maliciously, and that it was, anger and fear at its peak after 9/11 that led to this, and that, I've also been questioned about my loyalty towards the U.S., and I believe that I got involved because of those principles upon which our country was founded upon, and I think it's every American's duty to do that. So questions?
Hello. So I thought it was interesting. You said when you first went there to Guantanamo, you expected to meet terrorists. There's a cynical view that places like that exist to kind of maybe instill fear in people of the world, not to show any maybe dissent. So I'm just wondering, in your experience in visiting there, did you see anything to give you reason to believe that there's actual terrorists there?
Well, I do believe there are actual terrorists there because we know about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the 9/11 mastermind, and some of the other high-value detainees who, even though they were brought on Guantanamo's 5th anniversary and paraded before the press to say, hey, we do have bad guys here. That said, aside from the high-value detainees, me personally, I have not met any individual who, where there was any evidence to suggest that there had been any criminal activity committed against the United States. Guantanamo at its peak has had almost 800 prisoners. Today there's about 277. And out of all of the releases, none of them have ever been charged with anything criminal. So when you speak of innocence or guilt, it's a difficult concept because they're never charged with anything. So what are they innocent or guilty of? And 86% of those men were turned in at a time when, there was this bounty program that is largely unreported. But that said, I did meet individuals who I didn't believe were entirely truthful. There was one guy who said that he was illiterate and couldn't read or write. And then 2 months later, he was reading and writing flawlessly. But there was never any evidence, anything to suggest that he had committed any crime. And he was never charged. There was one man that I met who admitted to being Taliban and being a member of the Taliban. And at first I was kind of shocked and I was like, oh my God, this monster eating KFC in front of me. And the way he explained it was, I worked as a guard on a road at a check post and, I let cars through. And he equated it to somebody working for the State Department. He was like, the Taliban is the government. It is a huge entity, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people who worked for the Taliban with government jobs. Some people agreed with its political policies, others didn't. And he equated it with, somebody working for the State Department having ties to George Bush's war policy. So it was definitely a different perspective that I hadn't heard before. And yeah. You guys are quiet.
To what extent is the legal situation improving, and what more can be done?
Well, the Supreme Court did recently rule that the prisoners at Guantanamo do have a right of habeas corpus, and hopefully the administration respects that ruling. However, I don't believe that the vast majority of prisoners will ever see a civilian trial in the United States because it would only bring great shame to our country, further shame if we saw individuals like Haji Nasrat and Dr. Ali Shah and the vast majority of individuals who have been swept up in a public trial where there is no evidence to suggest that they've done anything criminal. And the transfers of a large number of detainees has increased before the Supreme Court ruling and after. And I believe that for the most part, they will be transferred back to their home countries before they ever see a fair trial. Perhaps for some of the individuals, the high-value detainees that the administration knows have committed terrorist acts, they will receive a public trial, but for the vast majority, I don't believe so. And in terms of what you can do, I guess, make noise.
Are you still in touch with the 8-year-old person that you met in the prison? And next question is, when the prisoners are released, how do they fit in Afghanistan when they go back to lead a normal life?
Well, I'll give the two examples of the first two prisoners that I spoke about. I am in touch with the 80-year-old Haji Nusrat. He was released after a little over 3 years, never having been charged. And I visited him in Afghanistan, and he was exactly who he said he was. His family is a great supporter of Karzai. His own son is a senator in Karzai's parliament. And when I visited him in Afghanistan, the first thing that he asked was whether I could help him get a visa to come to the United States, because he is paralyzed and he'd had, a bad surgery, and he showed me the scar on the back of his neck, and he wanted medical treatment. And I thought it was a joke. I was like, what? Why not England or France or whatever? And he launched into one of his grumpy tirades the same way he would in Guantanamo, and started going on about how he never believed that the U.S. had maliciously arrested him, and that he believed that it was a local Afghan who had, wanted to benefit financially. And so that was my experience with Haji Nusrat. I don't believe that he would ever qualify for a visa because he's still considered an enemy combatant like all of the released prisoners, with the exception of the Uyghurs, who are a Muslim minority and from China, and they were always classified as non-enemy combatants, but it was a small number. But the other example I can give is Dr. Ali Shah. When he was released, I know he suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. His family told me that his family in Washington, D.C., he has a large amount of family members who live in America, but they've spoken about how he sleeps in a fetal position, and he's fortunate enough to be educated and to have the resources and facilities to be aware of his depression and deal with it. And I can't speak for the others. For the most part, individuals that I've spoken with are just really happy to be home.
Other part of the question is how they were able to fit into the lifestyle when they go back to Afghanistan. They have to still earn money to support their livelihood. So how do they fit in? What job they do? What they do the whole day? How to help themselves?
Well, I think it varies between prisoner to prisoner. Dr. Ali Shah has his family. He comes. All of his brothers are also doctors, and most of them anyway. And they have opened up health clinics, and some of them write. He's been writing poetry and published a book. Quite a few have done that. There was a tire store owner from southern Afghanistan, and the last I spoke with him, he was sitting in the tire store talking to me from his brother's cell phone and trying to get back. It's a very tight-knit family structure in Afghanistan, and largely when the detainees do come home, they are met with huge crowds. The community gets together, and now the general trend is to put them in prison in Afghanistan for a little while, because the U.S. has built a prison. It's part of the Policharki prison in Kabul, but it is financed with U.S. money, this new block, and the Guantanamo detainees go there first, because initially it created this huge press event where the AP was there, and people like Dr. Ali Shah spoke to the press and spoke out, and it was like, all right, well, letting these people go, and here they are. And now that doesn't happen. They're released from Guantanamo when they're released, and they go to a prison in Afghanistan, and the trend has been that they're held there for 4 or 5 months, and they have a lawyer, but they're still not allowed to call evidence or witnesses, and they kind of tell their story. And for the most part, the ones who get out of Gitmo have been sent home, although a large number are still imprisoned in that new prison built by Halliburton, I think. Are we done? Yeah.
Thank you for coming here. It was fascinating to hear your story. I'm wondering if you had any troubles getting this book approved, or if you had to have it edited in any way, if there's anything that you were asked to take out, or could you just take your experiences, put them in this book, and publish it without any sort of oversight?
Well, there was definitely a lot of oversight. After my first trip to the base, when I met three guys, the pediatrician, the old man, and this businessman, I just felt totally duped and deceived, and I was like, I have to write about this. So I wrote this Washington Post op-ed, and it got a lot of good space and coverage, and I was thereafter banned from the base. And they said that the Post article created a security threat to the military base and the people who work there. Everything that I learned from the detainees in those meeting rooms is presumed classified. And so I submit it to the Department of Defense to clear. It's always abstractly, like, I don't believe they knew I was writing a book. Maybe they did, but... and they cleared most of the notes. Some of the things that didn't make it in the book were censored. And so, yeah, there are chunks that never made it in there.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.